Aloha and good morning, everyone. I do want to, before we get started, say a special thank you to everyone who joined us today. We are going to be talking about mental health and healing for dementia caregivers. If you have any questions, please feel free to share them as we move along, and there will be time at the end. I do want to acknowledge some sponsors that we have for today's presentation. That will be the Administration for Community Living, Catholic Charities Hawaii, the Circle of Care for Dementia, Haile Ku'ike, and then Mental Health America of Hawaii. What we're going to be talking about a little bit today is just looking at some of those statistics on dementia caregiving, discussing the importance of self-care as a dementia caregiver and the role that grief can have in that dementia caregiving, also looking at mental health strategies that are going to help address the stress, anxiety, and that feeling of burnout that we sometimes get. We're also going to look at the uniqueness of the past almost 22 months and what people have been experiencing along with COVID and caregiving, and then finally discussing resources that are available for all of us. If you've attended any of my trainings, you'll know I typically like to start with a quote, and I thought this one was very beautiful by Tia Walker. And it says, "To care for those who once cared for us is one of the highest honors." And I believe that that is true. So, what we're going to start off with is looking at statistics that are specific to the state of Hawaii. And these are statistics that were done by the Alzheimer's Association that are available on their website. And you'll see as we move through, if you're interested in following up on any of the statistics or some of the data that I share, that the citations are also on the slides. So the number of people 65 and older that are living with Alzheimer's in 2020, that was about 29,000 people here in Hawaii. To be clear, this is only for people with Alzheimer's and not for individuals that may have some other cognitive type of diagnosis. And this is also not for people who are undiagnosed. This is a very specific statistic. So you can imagine that that number is a bit higher. It's projected in 2025 to be at 35,000. So that's a 20.7% increase. You can see why it's so important to start talking more about how we can support our caregivers. We know that there's about 51,000 caregivers, and that 10.5 of those caregivers are experiencing poor physical health, that 14.9% of them have depression, that there's about 81 million hours of unpaid care that's happening. And about 65.3% of caregivers have chronic health conditions. So this is why we're really wanting to highlight the importance of getting our caregivers that support. And when we talk about how caregivers are impacted, of course, we want to start talking about self-care. There's a lot of ideas around self care, and I do often hear a lot of different myths. And so we're going to start with talking about some of those myths today. The first myth is the feeling that you always need to be productive, always need to be doing something. And so when we think about self care, we sometimes think that self care should be doing something. And that's not necessarily untrue, but sometimes the best kind of self care is just settling, is just sitting out in nature, taking some deep breaths, maybe enjoying a cup of tea, whatever it is that kind of re energizes you. And that is enough. That being and being centered is perfect. That's a perfect form of self care. If you're someone who really enjoys being physically active and that makes you feel more grounded, of course, absolutely engage in those activities. But just to let you know that self care doesn't have to mean more, it can also mean pulling back. Sometimes we think that when we're looking at self-care that there's certain emotions that we shouldn't feel. We briefly talked about when the introduction was happening that I've gone through my own experience of having provided hospice care and been a caregiver. And I do think that people have a feeling of, I shouldn't feel this way. And I always like to say that the emotions are informative. So if you feel angry, disappointed, resentful, if you feel like you're in a grieving process, all of that is validated and that is normal. What you choose to do, your behavior and what you choose to share is really where the important part comes in. All kinds of complicated emotions can come up while you're in the caregiving process. And it is crucial to be able to say, it's okay, I feel this way. Now, what do I want to do with how I feel? Sometimes we say, I don't have time for self care. I don't need self care. I just need to do these things. And the Reality of that is we all need self-care. We all need to do things on the day to day and put as much in as we can, even if they're small things, even if it's stretching your shower 5 minutes to kind of get that time to do that deep breathe, even if it's spending 5 extra minutes at the grocery store picking up a snack for yourself. However, you can find those little bits of time, they really start to count, even if you're not noticing them. It would be noticed if you didn't have them. Sometimes we think of emotions like they are linear and that once you feel this way, you'll just keep moving forward and you won't have to go back to that feeling. But there's a lot of things that happen through the caregiving process that changes how you feel about something. It's developmental, it is maturational, it is day one of caregiving looks very different than day 90 or 900. It does not look the same. And so you're going to keep having emotions about those experiences and they're going to change. And sometimes they're going to loop back around. And that is absolutely common. The other thing to think about is how much should we share? Like, how much should we actually be sharing about what's happening in this process, about what's happening with me, with the kids that are possibly in the household? When we talk about caregiving, we know that it impacts family systems, and there are primary caregivers and there are secondary caregivers, and that there will be children that are absolutely impacted by this process. And so it's important to think of what is developmentally and age appropriate to share. So, wanting to be mindful if they're archaic to not overshare, but also if they're teenagers to not undershare because they often know that something's happening, even if we're not telling them that something is happening or there's been a significant change. And it can also be good for them to know that maybe you need a little bit more support as well. Are not going to expect them to give it to us, but just to say, yeah, I'm really feeling tired today. I think I'm going to just slow things down and relax so that they know that this is not the moment to bring up like different new projects they have or this cool idea that they had that maybe that you don't have 100% attention to share in that moment. And so I think that's why it's important to keep them as appropriately updated as possible. Self care can look very different, like I mentioned before. It's very individualized. So, what I think is self care, for example, I love to garden. I have so many plants in the office, at home. Is not self care to other people. So, I have friends that are like, I give me a fake plant and I'll take care of that. So, we really want to honor the fact that self care does look very different from person to person. And it could be about time availability and just interests in general. And even with knowing what is good self care for you, the last 20 months has really shifted what's effective. So I really want to kind of say that again. The last 20 months has actually shifted what has worked for us before. I've always loved gardening. I gardened a little bit. In the last 20 months, I have gardened a jungle outside my home. I love reading, but I'm not reading classical literature. I'm reading beach vacation reads because I just don't have the attention and concentration to put into those kinds of hobbies right now, but I'm still enjoying engaging in them. And so maybe you've noticed that as well, that some of the things that you used to love to do, it just doesn't fulfill you as much, and that's okay. Self care shifts. It shifts from a day to day and sometimes from experience to experience. So be flexible and allow that to happen for yourself. Validate how you feel and really try to stay connected. I know that can be difficult, especially with it being unsafe sometimes and us wanting to be really mindful of holding that high safety for us and our loved ones. But be creative about how you stay connected. Use some of those social media platforms to be able to stay connected. Marco Polo was one I recently discovered where you send just short video clips and you can kind of toggle them back and forth. There are all kinds of ways you can use social media to stay connected with each other and feel more support and feel really engaged in your social support system. With everything that's been going on, it can be tempting to stay on top of it, to keep checking to see if anything's changed in terms of safety and quarantine and those types of things. But if you check too many times, it can actually increase your stress. We want you to be informed. We don't want you to be overwhelmed. So choose how many times you're going to check with news and staying updated. Maybe that's once a day, maybe it's twice a day in the morning and the evening, whatever works for you so that you feel informed, but again, not overwhelmed. Everything that we've been seeing in the news, it can be difficult to stay informed because we sometimes turn it on and we feel like, You had that deep sigh inside of ourselves, and we're just like, oh, not this too. So, when you're looking at the news, when you're staying updated, really look for those special stories. I like to think of them as the above and beyond stories. So, focus on the helpers, people who are going above and beyond to do things for the community because they're very heartwarming and they help balance out our feelings when we're engaged in social media and engaged in staying informed. Check in with people that are essential workers and people that are vulnerable in your circle and just send them a text, let them know, like, hey, I appreciate you, or hey, I'm thinking of you. Sometimes we just don't have the time to or the energy to push outside of that, but it's really nice to acknowledge it and to still feel connected to those people in your circle. We sometimes lose our capacity to maintain a schedule. For some things, it's very easy to maintain a schedule. Like from my experience, it was very easy to maintain a medication schedule. But then I started to work my own personal schedule around that, which is kind of a natural consequence. But then I started to kind of let go of some of the things I needed to let go of. So maybe my sleep schedule was a little off, or I'm still in pajamas at a certain amount of time. When I was also working and doing the hospice caregiving, I definitely noticed it was harder for me to sit back and be intentional about scheduling and self-care. And that I was tempted to steal from my own self-care schedule to be able to do just a little bit more that was needed. But I started to notice that if you keep borrowing from tomorrow, then you just are more and more tired for today. So try to maintain as much as you can a really great schedule and put in that self-care. And I know it feels like adding more things onto your plate. And we're going to talk about how to adjust your plate, but really think about the coping skills that you're going to need and mindfulness. And we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes. Again, when we're talking about social media, because I do think a lot of people spend quite a bit of time on the internet and the social media now just because of the nature of us spending more time at home. Be mindful of the sites that you're going to and getting information from. And this is part of managing that feeling of being overwhelmed. Make sure it's reputable. Make sure that it's a site that's giving you really good concrete information, because it can be someplace that looks reputable but might be actually sharing misinformation. So misinformation is information that isn't accurate, but it doesn't have a malicious intent. It's not meant to make people upset or have like a political agenda. They just don't know, right? And then disinformation is inaccurate information, incorrect information that's absolutely meant to have a malicious agenda that separates people. So we're trying to be really careful about contributing to misinformation and disinformation by checking those sites. I mentioned before the importance of looking for those above and beyond stories. And part of it is making a sandwich. So we call it our social media sandwich. And what that really means is if you want to share information that's important, but maybe it's a little bit like emotionally intense, what you're going to do is you're going to share something very lighthearted beforehand, then share that important information. And then after that, share again something lighthearted. So the lighthearted pieces are the bread. And the really important part, if you wanted to share that was just a little bit more intense, that's that middle portion. Why do we do that? It's because it creates a 2-for-1, which means other people who are experiencing your social media accounts will also feel a nice balance and will continue to stay engaged and informed by continuing to look at your accounts and look at what you're sharing, because they're not going to feel overwhelmed, and it creates a little bit more positivity on those social media platforms. The other thing to think about if you're sharing something, it's just that general kind of really thoughtful question, which is, does this help inform or support other people? So sometimes the support things that I share are really cute animal videos, and sometimes information I share is really important information that someone could use. So I think about what I'm sharing and why I'm sharing it, and I really want to make sure that I'm doing what is at the highest best for my family or my community. Again, I share those helpful resources, even if they're not for me. I think it could be helpful for someone else, and so I go ahead and share that. And then I also limit my time. I found it's very easy to just kind of scroll through and then I look up and I'm like, what time is it? So really think about limiting your time so that you don't find yourself even more behind on things you need to do, or that you've been kind of passively engaged in an activity that, while enjoyable, doesn't give you as much return as maybe some other self-care things would. You've heard me mention mindfulness a couple of times thus far, and I do want to talk about it for a moment. Mindfulness, if you're familiar, you know what a great practice it is. But if you're not familiar, it might feel a little large. The idea of, okay, I'm already putting in so much time and energy, I'm already fatigued and tired. How am I going to add in this practice of mindfulness? But at the core of it, when you look at mindfulness, the idea is that you stay in the moment. So, what mindfulness actually does is it frees you of thinking about the past and things that you could have done, and it frees you from thinking about the future and the things that you need to do. Like, okay, so tomorrow I'm going to, but you can spend a lot of today's energy on things that aren't changeable because they're already done, or things that are kind of unpredictable because anything can happen in the tomorrow. And instead, you just look at today. What can I do in the next hour? What can I do in the next 10 minutes? And when you start to do that, it actually frees you up. It gives you a little bit more feeling of like, I can do that. I can look at what's just in the next hour. It also has this element of radical acceptance. And I'm going to talk about that in detail in just a moment. For some people, mindfulness could include meditation, and meditation can be sitting down with your eyes closed. It can also be a walking meditation of just going out in nature, deep breathing, and letting all the different senses come in. What do you hear? What do you smell? What do you hear and feel come into your awareness? And that's it. You're just enjoying the space around you. And for some people, it's a little bit more structured and it could include prayer. It can be helpful when you're talking about stress management, and I will be transparent. I am guilty of this. I am an avid multitasker, and I often have to tell myself, like, just do one thing. But what we know by research is that to people, the majority of people are not good at multitasking. We think that we are, but in reality, like myself, I think that I am. But in reality, we're not great at it because if you and again, we don't start our day with 100% attention. You probably start, if you're having a great day, around 80%. So imagine 80% split between every single task that you're juggling, and then something happens, something crucial, something new, something unexpected. You're going to have to start to pull that attention from all those different places. And that's why you start to feel overwhelmed and stressed, because now you're having to pull from a lot of different places instead of stopping the one task you were doing and refocusing. So, as much as possible, realistically, do single tasking. We know that for some people, they do need to multitask for work. But when you have those really great moments and you see, like, oh, I could do a single task and just eating and enjoying it, or having this really good supportive conversation and putting my phone on the side, then do engage in it. It's good when you're having those supportive conversations to be accessible, not distracted, responsive. So you're engaged in the conversation and being that really great listener. I said that I would talk about radical acceptance for a little bit. And if you're familiar with the serenity prayer, that is a wonderful example of radical acceptance. I kind of think that this is one of those skills that is not talked about enough. But if you use this consistently, you're going to notice how much it helps you manage from the day to day. So, what is radical acceptance? Radical acceptance, when you boil it down, is going to be it is what it is. Seems kind of simple, right? But it's not. Radical acceptance says, let me look at what's in front of me and I'm going to decide what is in my power and my responsibility to change. Can I change this thing? So, if I can change it, I'm going to put all my energy and focus there. And then I'm going to look at that and say, what is in my experience in this situation that I cannot change? And I'm not going to put any energy there. So a great example of that would be, and this is a very light example, but let's say I have a picnic planned and I'm very excited. I wake up and I'm packing my little picnic basket. I'm just so excited to do this thing. And then I walk outside with my basket and it is pouring down rain. Now, in this moment, I can radically accept that it's raining and that picnic is not happening. And I can be upset about that all day because that is outside of my control. There's nothing I can do about it. But if I continue to be upset, it's because I feel like something should have happened. This isn't fair. Why today? And just continue to perseverate and give energy to something that I cannot change. Or I can say, yep, that's kind of disappointing. And I can own that's how I feel. But then I can say, you know what's in my power? It's to change my expectation. And it's to create maybe an indoor picnic and enjoy that instead. Change the location, change the date, do something that helps me put energy and focus where I can make change. And unfortunately, in that example, it's really about how I see things and how I feel about those things is where I can put that time. Radical acceptance was a really crucial element for me when I was going through my process in looking at whenever something changed for my loved one, when looking at when I got new updates from medical providers to say I cannot change this outcome. I cannot change that update. I can only change how I feel about that and how we're going to adjust the household to that. And so I would let myself again feel how I needed to feel, but then focus that time and energy into what I could do something about. It doesn't mean that you like the change. It doesn't mean you even agree with the change. Like if I was choosing, this isn't what I would choose. It just means that you accept it because it is happening. It's a daily choice to consistently look at the situation and say, this is outside of my control and this is inside of my control. Because on some days, we're really tempted to take back some of that control. It makes us feel good, but it also can be wasted energy. When people, and this could happen, when people are not practicing radical acceptance, you might have already noticed this if you are in a large caregiving support system for someone, that there are some people who struggle with radical acceptance who maybe instead use denial, like, nope, it's fine, that's okay, we're going to keep doing what we're doing. And they really struggle with transitioning into that new part. And that is part of their process. So they're going to need the time and space to figure out how they're going to move into that different place. And we're just again going to focus on ourselves because I cannot control someone else. I can only control myself. And so I leave them to their own kind of process. When you fight against it, when you start to engage in that denial, it really does take a lot of energy for them to maintain that stance. And so it really can take away from the energy that you have for today. The other thing that radical acceptance can be is an alternative to forgiveness. So if you think about this in the example of relationships, so let's say that you're in a difficult relationship with someone, you cannot change them or their behavior. As much as we like to think that we can, you can't. And so what you end up doing is saying, this is what it is. I don't have to forgive you for the things that you've done. I just accept that you've done them and I leave it and move on. And that can be helpful for some people. This I think is a cute example. I really like the Awkward Yeti cartoons. This is Heart and Brain, and so Brain's like, Heart, the key to success in life is having a plan and sticking to it. And he has this beautiful plan, and then it rains, it storms, and then Heart says, I don't think life cares about your plan. And he says, but it had bullet points. And I think that we sometimes feel that way, right? As we move through this experience, this journey, that we have just the most perfect plans sometimes, or things are going manageably well. And then something happens and throws us off our plan, off our schedule. And I think that's part of radical acceptance power, is it helps us kind of go, yep, that does happen, and then readjust, readapt. When we talk about caregiving, it can be a very long process of grief. So, grief isn't just about the loss of somebody, it's the loss of something or someone's adaptability, someone's ability to kind of engage in life, someone's capacity to be able to have a meaningful relationship with you or to talk about stories. It could be the loss of what you thought your year would look like. It could be very complex, this grief, and involve a lot of different things. If you have a pre-existing history of trauma, you will notice that the deeper you get into your grief process, the more it can pull on that history of trauma. As we moved through the last 20 months, we prior to it happening, prior to COVID, we didn't think about as much, what kind of coping skills do I have? What kind of self-care schedule am I in? Am I going to be okay if a big stressor comes? We just kind of had what we have. Some of us were maybe a little bit more aware than others, but then it happened. This large kind of global issue happened, and we started to notice, like, I don't have enough. I don't feel like I have enough that supports me, or like, today's really rough, I don't know what to do about that. And so I think that is the difficulty in when we talk about these things, is that you had this pre-existing amount of self-care and coping skills, and it was working for you. And then we added in a lot of extra stressors. And so some of you might find it's not as effective. And so we're going to talk about that and talk about maybe what you can use. But also be aware that people cope very differently. Some people are wanting to talk about what's happening and really kind of work through it out loud. And some people do not want to talk about what's happening because they're still contemplative, they're thinking about those things. We all grieve very differently. Some people cry and they feel like, oh, that's so cathartic. And other people don't. And it doesn't mean that one person's grieving better than someone else. It's just different. And when we think about it that way, we really want to honor and give space to everyone's different experiences and just say, just because I don't grieve that way doesn't mean they're not grieving. And so I'm going to ask them, like, how are you? It's a very simple question to ask, like, how are you doing? And then let them tell us their experience. There is a model called the Kubler-Ross grief model, and I want to be clear when I say I like this model because it is very explicit. Like these are the things. But when we look at the research, it doesn't hold up. It's not as strong as we would like it to be. So, really, I think about this more as a conversational piece to think about the different ways that you might be experiencing emotions around grief. So, the first one, again, we talked about this with the struggles with radical acceptance, is denial. Not me, not now, not this person, right? It's this element of shock as we go through our grief. It could be anger, irritability, anxiety, and that's because we're feeling that loss of control, that there's nothing I can do to change the situation. I feel helpless. For some people, they will go into bargaining. Like, if I do this, then will you do this? And that could be speaking to, a medical provider. It could be speaking to the universe, to your creator, because you're engaging in your faith system. But it's the idea that if you change some part of your behavior, then the situation will change. It's the bargaining. Depression can be an experience, deep sadness, the grief, and then acceptance. And that's that radical acceptance is moving into the place of this is going to be new and this is going to be something I'm going to have to figure out how I feel about that. So those can all be different elements of someone's grief process. And you might end up going into some of these phases multiple times. You might go through all of them and get to acceptance and then wake up one morning and say, I'm angry today. And that's okay. Because again, these aren't linear in a line and these aren't meant to each happen. And these are more about looking for yourself and doing a check in and saying, where am I at? Or looking at other people in the support system and saying, where are they at? And then just asking, hey, how are you doing? I did want to touch base briefly on how COVID has impacted caregiving because this is new information coming out. And I do think in the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to see a lot more information about how people are being impacted. It is very early on. If you're familiar with research, typically, if you're lucky, you'll get the year previous to the one you're in. But if it's a much larger study, it often takes 2 to 3 years to get that information. So this is very burgeoning. And what we've been seeing is that people who are caregiving and their loved ones are experiencing more stress. The caregiver is experiencing anxiety, depression, issues with sleep. The loved one's noticing that their schedule is being affected, that there are changes happening, and that maybe some of the things they used to go to do, like adult day programs, are just not open. And so that disruption in their schedule can sometimes lead to like cognitive confusion or emotional upset. And so that is absolutely what we're seeing across the board. There's less access to supportive therapies and programs because of the nature of what's been happening. We even have the fact that caregivers are kind of shrinking their circles. They're having to look at and think about things like, and this happened for me, for example, in my experience, they're having to think about like, we want to make sure that our loved one does not also get COVID-19 while they're being cared for, because that would be very difficult to deal with on top of the day-to-day and essential activities. So who do we not want to come visit as much anymore because they are not as strict in their risk tolerance? Um, what can I do because I still have to either go to work, go to the grocery store, and do these essential activities for my loved one. Like I have a fear that I'll be the one that possibly unwittingly passes that on to them. And so there's a lot of fear for caregivers around their loved one contracting COVID-19 while getting the support they need. There's anxiety over missing work because of all of these factors. And of course, just the idea that there is, yes, less resources, less support because maybe you're having to shrink your circle. And people in general, when we start to think about the last 20 months, caregiver or not, they are languishing. And this concept of languishing has been around for about 20 years, but we're really talking about it now. So, languishing is this idea that you have low energy, fatigue, low motivation. And even when you're doing things that you normally enjoy doing, you're just not getting the return. You're like, I still just feel tired. It just wasn't as fun as I thought it was going to be. You're languishing in your mood. And we're seeing higher rates of it because of COVID. For those of you who are doing reentry, you're going back to work or you're doing additional activities that you weren't doing in the last 20 months, you might be noticing that you're still feeling anxious. So maybe you're getting together with some family to have a dinner and you haven't seen these family members in, 10 months, 20 months because you've shrank your circle, but now you want to expand it back out because you need more support. So you plan this thing and you're going to go do it and you still feel anxious. That's reentry anxiety. And I think when you look at that combination, that I have low energy, low motivation, I'm really having a hard time getting up and getting going. And then I go do this thing, I still feel anxious doing it. That is why I think so many people are saying my self-care isn't as effective, or like I just am having a hard time. I just have this general feeling of fatigue and anxiety. I think that part of this is that even when we're going back and adding in additional things, it's still anxiety provoking. And for caregivers, they are juggling multiple roles, even multiple unexpected roles, from working, caregiving. Some of you were now at home educators very quickly. And so you had additional roles that were not even expected over the last 20 months. And it's very difficult to take on these large additional roles and to feel like you're doing your best. That is the number one complaint I have heard. I don't feel like I'm doing my best. And I would say if that is a feeling that you have, is to really sit down and radically accept your best looks different every day. So sometimes my best, when it had been a very difficult couple of days when I was caregiving, sometimes my best was a shower. I would say, you know, I have like a lengthy experience in self care and mental health, and my best today is my shower. And that's the reality of it. And I think once you are gentle with yourself like that and you say, yeah, sometimes that is your best for the day. And maybe 2 days from now, at the end of that day, you're going to say, wow, this was a really good day. Like, look at my best, very different. Um, but give yourself some patience and grace to have days that do include your best being small, but manageable and done. When I started to look at some of the research, because I will say I got very personally invested in interest in self-care and caregivers because that was my experience um, very recently. And so I started to think about how are people doing this for years, because that was mine was only like a handful of months. And I thought, how are people doing this for years? How are they engaging with this system? Absolutely your mental health gets impacted. And so I started looking into the research, and people were referring to caregivers as that second invisible patient, because the caregivers were sacrificing so much energy and time and also prioritizing their loved one and often not taking care of themselves for many different reasons. Some of those basic things that they were reporting, saying this is what we're seeing from the caregivers who are coming in, is physical issues. So pain, fatigue, sleep issues, emotional ones, irritability, mood swings, behavioral ones, just withdrawing from support, because it can be difficult to engage with support systems, especially when you have people who are not radically accepting adjustments and changes that need to be made. maybe even unhealthy coping skills. It was very tempting, and I did do it to have like, I'm gonna have a treat today. I'm gonna go eat this my like comfort food today, because that was an easy pickup and an easy addition. But too many of those unhealthy coping moments and choices do add up. And then, of course, cognitively having racing thoughts because of the stress and anxiety, having a difficult time focusing and really being mindful of what you're doing, all those different tasks, it can be very exhausting. We've talked quite a bit about all the ways that we're being impacted by so many different things, but I really want to highlight that there are things, programs, interventions that are helpful for caregivers. One of the number one things that you can do, and these are going to be our top three interventions. One of the things that you can do is find an evidence based intervention. There are so many wonderful interventions out there. And if your intervention is to do some like, we'll just kind of say, like, I want to go to an aromatherapy class. That's an intervention I want to do. Absolutely do that. But these are the ones they found throughout research and studies that have a great return, and that we don't have to be like, it could work, it might not work. I'm a huge proponent of aromatherapy. I think it's helpful. But if I was going to say, hey, this is the thing that is really backed by research, it would be these things. So, an evidence based intervention could be something like REACH, which you're going to talk about in just a second in a little bit more detail. It's resources for enhancing Alzheimer caregiver health. And what they did is they looked at kind of what is helpful to caregivers. How can we put that into a couple of sessions that are very structured, and so that people can come in, get the assistance they need, and come back out with this like awareness and information and experience. The other thing I want to highlight is individual therapy. There are so many things that come up when you're caregiving, whether it is stress in the support system between you and other loved ones, just stress in general from work, caregiving, if you're having to home educate, care for small children, whatever those multiple roles may be, can be very stressful. And if the relationship with the person that you're caring for had some kind of conflict, wasn't always easy, that there's some unresolved conversations that weren't able to happen, those can come up during caregiving, even if you're not speaking them out loud, but they emotionally are there. So I always highly recommend individual therapy. It can be very hard to talk to people who are also in your family system and part of this care about your own feelings, about your own stressors. And so I highly recommend thinking about talking to a mental health professional who is your person. That is your person to go to. They don't have any bias, they don't have any buy in or opinion. They're just there to support you. The other thing that we know is really effective is peer support groups, other people outside of your family system who are also going through similar things. I found that extremely helpful to talk to other people who were also had caregived in hospice to help me normalize my experience. Because I'm like, is this normal? Should I feel this way? And then to have someone say, I also felt that way was really nice. Some of the research does say, and it's not a top three, but it is in there when they say that, keep engaging as much as possible in your leisure and physical activities. It helps you maintain your identity as a person and your self care. Those can be very helpful. So, if you're an avid tennis player, if you love to run, if you enjoy gentle stretching and yoga, whatever those things are, if you have hobbies, as much as you can, maintain those for yourself because it will help with your mood. So let's talk a second about support, because there are different kinds of support. And these were the ones I thought about the most when I was in my own experience. Instrumental support is help with something specific. This was so helpful for me. So this would be with someone else in your support system being able to say, I need some help with housework, and they say, great, on Tuesday I can come over from 2 to 4, I'll clean the kitchen. Wonderful, right? Like that help was so nice. I'd have cousins call and say, hey, we're going to drop off food. We're going to pop this into your freezer for the next week, and then you'll have this dish to eat tonight. If you need us to pick up groceries, send us a list. That to me was more helpful than someone saying, what can I do? Because my attention and focus was not so clear. The idea of sitting down and trying to think of a list was really overwhelming to me. Some people could go this, and this. And there were moments when I was more well slept that I could. However, there are definitely days when it was hard to think about it. But having people text me and go, I will be near the pharmacy today. Do you need me to pick up any medication? I can drop it off at this time. That kind of instrumental help that was explicit and clear was so much more helpful to me. And so that can be something helpful to let the other people in your life know about. Like, yes, let me know when you have days free or time free and what you're able to do. Emotional support, having friends, family, and mental health professionals. And we're going to talk about where to find those mental health professionals in just a second. The other thing is just informational. It's so nice to have the information and to feel educated, because a lot of times when you're in the caregiving process, you're struggling to find like what's going to happen, what's the time frame, like what is this look, what is this, is often the question that you're asking yourself about a lot of different things. So being able to just have that information to stay informed and to understand what's happening, um, can really help you feel more grounded. And of course, getting that support from peers who say, yep, we went through the same thing. This is what it kind of looked like for us. Yours might end up being different, but just having someone to say, me too, is nice. I think that when we start to move into talking about support, it wouldn't be honest to say that all support is helpful. There is unwelcome support. People who have wonderful intentions, or maybe not great intentions, some of them, but the majority of them do have wonderful intentions of wanting to be helpful, but it's unwelcome help. Maybe they're coming in or dropping off or doing things that weren't asked for, weren't needed, and are actually complicating your schedule as a primary caregiver, or complicating your loved one's schedule. And you're like, this is just making things more complicated. My experience was that I had someone who was doing this, the most motivated, unhelpful helper in my experience. And so I started to have to be like, I'm going to set some boundaries and say, like, yes, I would love your help. This is what I need. And if they could do that, wonderful. If they couldn't, I was like, these things aren't helpful. So I will say it does sometimes stretch our comfort zone to set those boundaries. It sometimes does stretch our relationships as we move through this process. But if you're the primary caregiver, you're the primary person, and it's for you to maintain your self care for the longevity of what is needed. And so it is crucial to set boundaries with people who might be adding in that stress, and to radically accept, I can't change who they are, how they're approaching this, but I can change how I interact with them. We talked about reach a few minutes ago, when we were looking at those evidence-based interventions, those top three. And when I found out about this, I'm like, this is so brilliant, because with COVID, people's mental health has been impacted. And so accessibility has been really limited across the board. And to know that Catholic Charities has this available, that you can call them, put in this appointment, that it's free, they personalize it to you, is so wonderful. And so what you're going to do is, if you're interested, you're going to call that number on the bottom, that 527-4777, or email them and let them know that you're interested in taking reach. And then they're going to go ahead and schedule you for those sessions. I just think it's a fantastic thing to be able to sit down with someone who is well trained and well versed and possibly has a personal experience with this to help you move through your own process. It can really help you. The other things that are available is, we talked about mental health professionals and how that can work for you. I will be very honest in letting you know, the last 2 years, I think the wait has been about 4 to 8 weeks to see a professional. So the fact that Catholic Charities does offer counseling as well, reach out to them and see what their openings look like. They do have telehealth. So if you're wanting to stay home and be safe, which for some people, the idea of getting dressed, finding parking, going out, it just is more time away that they could be doing something else at that time. So telehealth is absolutely a helpful tool to have. So there's information there. And then the Hawaii Psychological Association, if you go to that link, it's going to help you find a therapist in your area. You can search for what you're looking for. I really like Psychology Today because it shows you their profiles, their pictures, it shows you what insurances they take. And then you can also screen for someone who has experience working with caregivers. Now, this is my plug saying, please find someone who does have experience working with caregivers. Psychologists and therapists come in a vast rainbow of differences. My specialization is in trauma. and other people's specializations are in other things. So I would not want them learning about dementia caregiving through you. I would rather you find someone who has worked with a lot of people who have been dementia caregivers, who are well versed and can say, yes, this is something I hear quite frequently. Yes, this is a great resource for you. And they share their knowledge with you instead. So you are absolutely allowed when you find someone that you're interested in to call them and ask if they have experience with it and to opt not to see them if they don't. I think the profound thing that kind of stood out to me after my kind of hospice experience and my grief process was that even through the difficulty, even through the pain, I was very cognizant of the benefit. And there are benefits to being a caregiver. So 55 to 90% of dementia caregivers do say they have positive experiences, and that includes this feeling of togetherness, just enjoying a process of togetherness and sharing in activities. There's a reciprocal bond of caring and being cared for. There is absolutely a feeling of spiritual and personal growth and an increase in faith. And I will say it's not just specific to organized religion. No matter what your faith background is, and I've worked with people from all different faiths, from people who were spiritualists to people who did conform to a more kind of conservative Christian faith. Whatever your belief system is, as you move through and you take care of someone and they're moving through their life process towards the end, you do start to ask yourself what gives you meaning. What are your priorities and values? What do you want your life to look like? Because you're reflecting back on their experience as well. And so people find that they lean into their spiritual beliefs, their faith systems more. And for some people, they say, my beliefs don't help me sort this out. My belief systems make me feel more anxious about what I see happening in front of me. And I always think that if that's happening, to lean into talking to a spiritual leader out of your faith, to talk to someone maybe who's also been through a similar experience and has a similar faith, because it could just be that this is something that occurs. The idea of what happens as we age and what happens as we transition out of these bodies and what happens when people are in pain, all those questions come up. And so having whatever your belief system is, whatever your meaning making system is, be able to support you through that is crucial. The other thing it can do is just help you feel like you are accomplished and you have mastery. I think that when you have a good day and you're like, yes, like I was able to do all of these things, I was able to spend that time, I was able to engage meaningfully, and that feels good to me, that is some of the things that we can gain. There are a lot of different resources available, and I'm going to talk about those for just a few minutes. You will have access to this crisis resource sheet if you're interested. These are some of the ones that we put out there. And I will say, if you don't need them, just put them into your phone. So the ones I would highly recommend having are the Suicide Prevention Lifeline. That's the National Suicide Prevention number. Hawaii Cares, they have a lot of expansive services, including referrals for substance abuse. They have COVID support lines. And so they offer quite a few things now. You have a crisis text line in case you don't want to call, but you do want to text. The Trevor Project, that's for LGBTIQ youth. And then, of course, we have Domestic Violence Action Center, the Sex Abuse Treatment Center, any of these like crisis resource numbers that your family system or people within your community system might need. I always just save them into my phone, and that way I don't have to hunt them down if it needs to be shared. The other resources that I wanted to make sure that you had, because we have talked quite a bit about all the wonderful benefits that Catholic Charities has, is to let you know that there are these workshops that are available. And so that link will take you to those dementia training workshops in case you're interested in learning a little bit more. Of course, the Alzheimer's Association, one of the things that I learned through this process is that they have so many great resources, from virtual classes to trainings to just information galore, and things that are specific to Hawaii that we'll talk about in just a second. Um, this Alzheimers.gov, it has a really nice sheet about taking care of yourself. And then there are links as well to the National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center and the National Institute on Aging, the Department of Health and Human Service. And again, you can get these slides that have all these links in there if you're interested. So we do have a Hawaii chapter for the Alzheimer's Association here. That number is a 24/7 helpline, which is fantastic. That's at 808-591-2771. There's also a national number listed there if you need it. They do have support groups. I was on there looking just the other day, and it's wonderful. You can put in what you're looking for, what area you're looking for here in Hawaii, and it will show you all of the classes that are available near you with people who are going through a similar experience as you. So that's a wonderful place to find peer support groups that are virtual. So it's safe and you can do it from the safety of your home. I did want to mention apps. Not everyone is interested in apps, but we do have these two. I highly recommend them. I don't recommend apps that are already on my phone that I don't already use. So if you're wanting to learn a little bit more about mindfulness, the COVID Coach is a great place to go. So it's going to help you manage stress by learning different mindfulness techniques. It's going to help you track your mood so you can say, wow, over the last like week or two, my mood's kind of been down, and that just brings it back into your awareness to be able to say, maybe I do need a little bit more self care. Maybe I should reach out to my support system and say, hey, can you come in so I can take a little bit more breaks because my mood's down? These are great because these were actually created by the US Department of Veterans Affairs and the National Council for Post Traumatic Stress Disorder. So, what this means is these are heavily evidence based and informed by large institutions that do that research. I have used them and I really enjoy them. The other one is CBTI, that's cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. This one's really helpful. I say that because I also am like, I will steal from my sleep schedule any chance I get. I try not to, but I do. So, what this does is it helps you track your sleep. Now, when I was starting to use it, I thought, I mean, my sleep's not great, but it's not terrible. But they start asking you questions like, when did you fall asleep? When did you want to fall asleep? Did you wake up during the night? Did you wake up rested? Or did you wake up feeling again unrested? They start to ask you really specific questions. Did you wake up before you wanted to be awake? And they take all that into account and then they pin it. And so you can see over a long trajectory of time what your sleep actually looks like. And instead of thinking like, how many hours did I get? You start to think about how many quality hours did I get? And how much disruption had I had? And that tracks, and they give you places to get reminders, and then they give you really helpful recommendations. And these are both free. So, highly recommend these apps. When I was going through my process, I leaned very heavily into reading, and sometimes they were just beach reads just for fun. But this book kind of showed up at my house after I had returned home. So I was caregiving for my father in the Appalachian Mountains. And this book kind of showed up at my house. The boy, I think it's The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse. And I just thought it was so poignant. It's just these beautiful watercolor pictures with these little quotes on them. It's not very plot driven. It's just about a boy who encounters all these different animals and the things they say to each other. And I actually have this one framed in my office because I thought, oh, what a beautiful thing to remind myself of. And what it says is, sometimes I feel lost, said the boy. Me too, said the mole, but we love you and love brings you home. So I think it's a really nice focus for all of our dementia caregivers and our loved ones and family members, that like it's really about our relationships and keeping that going and keeping that love intact. You had a pretest before we came into this webinar today. I did want to go over it for just a minute. The first one was, caregivers are often referred to as the invisible second patient. Absolutely. And it's one that we need to make a lot more visible. The five stages of grief in the Kubler-Ross method are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. That is true. Self-care has little to no impact on a caregiver's day-to-day mental health. False. Caregiving absolutely needs self-care to it to be able to maintain consistently that good mental wellness. The next one, radical acceptance is not an effective coping strategy for dementia caregivers. That is false. Radical acceptance is a form of mindfulness that can really help you as you adapt through every change in your loved one, every change in a situation, even change in your emotional experience of something, to be able to choose to invest your energy where it can make the most impact after you validate how you feel. Radical acceptance is a great skill to have. And the top three interventions of support for dementia caregivers are evidence based programs and treatments, individual therapy, and peer support groups. Yes, yes, true. So we really think about that. If you are missing one of those elements, consider whether or not it's an element that you need. I know this is a lot of information, so I wanted to make sure that if you had any questions, you could absolutely reach out to myself. Again, Dr. Mestisa Goss, Program Director for Mental Health America of Hawaii. If you email us, is it that info at mentalhealthhawaii.org, or you can call us. That top number is for Oahu and the bottom number is for Maui County. We are here to provide any support and resources that we can for you. But again, I want to thank you so much for spending your morning with us and coming to learn a little bit and sharing with me about dementia caregiving.